Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about intestinal permeability, leaky gut, and some common myths associated with intestinal permeability. This is a really important topic because I think there's a lot of um, incorrect information about intestinal permeability out there on the internet, even healthcare professionals, even experts in books, what they're writing about how to treat it, how to identify it, what's associated with. There just seems to be some incorrect information. So I've been a functional medicine practitioner for 20 years. I've been working with leaky gut for over 20 years. And I also have my PhD in health science with concentrations in immunology and toxicology. And I am a member of the American Association of Immunologists, which means I've had immunologists review my credentials and my publications and then accept me as an immunologist. And I published several papers on intestinal permeability itself. So I think I'm able to give you a perspective from a scientist who's actually done research and published new findings with intestinal permeability, and also as a clinician who's been working with intestinal permeability for over 20 years. Now, the first thing what I would like to do in this little talk today is maybe spend the first 20 minutes reviewing some of the key concepts and principles of intestinal permeability. And then I want to get into the 5 most common myths about intestinal permeability, how it applies to clinical practice and to autoimmune disease and to inflammation and to food sensitivities. And then open it up to any questions anyone may have for those of you that are joining us today. So the key thing to remember about intestinal permeability, it's just basically, people have used the term leaky gut. And in the scientific literature, they've been using the word intestinal permeability for decades. So the slang term is leaky gut, but in the scientific journals, it's intestinal permeability. And what intestinal permeability means is that the intestines have tight junctions, and then these tight junctions just basically open up. And when the intestinal tight junctions open up, then that sets the stage up for chronic inflammation, and it causes food proteins that are not completely digested to go through the gut. And when food proteins are not completely digested and they go through the gut, they then trigger an immune response. So when you typically digest a food protein, the protein is very large, and then it gets broken down to smaller type structures, and then finally into tiny little small molecular weight amino acids that can then cross these tight little junctions of the gut. And intestinal permeability, these tight junctions really open up, and then larger, or what they call middle molecular weight, or large molecular weight particles cross. And then when these large particles cross the intestinal tight junction, this then causes the immune system in the gut to respond to it as if it was a pathogen, and it starts to react against it. And then this reaction itself causes significant inflammation throughout the body, and it also can start to have a person develop food sensitivities and antibody reactions to those undigested food proteins. And this really sets up the stage for chronic disease and chronic inflammation. Now, when you look at people that have intestinal permeability, the first thing you need to know is that you don't have to have any gastrointestinal symptoms. Sometimes the only only indication you may have intestinal permeability clinically is you just have chronic pain, chronic inflammation, chronic swelling, and you notice that certain foods and certain diets can exaggerate your pain and inflammation and swelling. And then certain foods, if you eat a clean diet, can really impact how you feel and your swelling inflammation. So those are some indications you may have intestinal permeability. Now, intestinal permeability in the scientific literature is associated with things like chronic depression, where that's the only symptom. People have major depressive disorder, and they get tested for intestinal permeability. They find they have it, they treat it, they get better. That's been published in 2 studies so far. So they found those associations, and then intestinal permeability has been associated with the development of autoimmune disease. In animal studies, they've been able to recreate that model. And intestinal permeability, for the most part, is linked just to chronic inflammatory conditions of all types now in the literature. Now, that's the key thing. So one of the key things is just when someone has a chronic disease, chronic inflammation, intestinal permeability is a potential mechanism. Now, it's not a disease, and it's not something that conventional healthcare uses to. It's not a diagnosis in conventional healthcare. There's not a insurance code for intestinal permeability. Hasn't caught up with in the healthcare system. So we have all this literature and research on intestinal permeability in the in the immunological literature for many years now. And then we have people that practice lifestyle medicine and diet and nutrition that look at intestinal permeability, like functional medicine practitioners. And then we have conventional medicine that hasn't really used that diagnosis in looking at chronic disease yet, despite the fact that it's in the literature. So I think we're going to see intestinal permeability get more attention as they start to develop some drugs for it. Let me give you some background. Now, when you look at intestinal permeability, it's something that natural medicine, naturopathic medicine has had theorized for I don't know, over 50 years. It's just something that everyone that was traditionally taught naturopathy would look at improving gastrointestinal health to improve health and disease, and that's been pretty common naturopathic education. And then it wasn't until the year 2000 where a researcher named Elisa Fasana and his team at the University of Maryland, they were able to identify the protein that actually opened up tight junctions. And they were looking at cholera infections, and with cholera, there's a toxin that's released, and it's a protein that's released that then causes the intestinal tight junctions to open up. And that happens normally when we have to get rid of a pathogen. So when we get certain infections like cholera, our gastrointestinal tract releases messenger proteins that actually open up the tight junctions so we can really get rid of the pathogen from our gastrointestinal tract as soon as possible. So in April 2000, Lisa Fasana's team identified this protein that they labeled zonulin, and the cholera infection was something called ZOT, zonulin including toxin. And they wrote a letter to the Lancet saying, hey, we discovered this new protein, and we feel that has a major role to play with intestinal permeability. They then did further research and did different types of protein spectroscopy, and then looked at the data bank of amino acids and proteins, and found really what they found was something called haptoglobulin. But at that time, it was registered as a protein with no known function. So what they've actually done is discovered a known protein that actually had function to actually open up the intestinal tight junctions. And then the research started to get flooded with intestinal permeability research because they found out that there's a protein that actually causes leaky gut, and they were able to then create animal models and use zonulin as a way to cause leaky gut in studies and then really evaluate its effect on health and disease. And now there's several thousand papers published on the role of intestinal permeability and zonulin on various conditions. Now, what's very interesting though is that Elisa Fasano then moved to Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital and started to do some serious research on leaky gut intestinal permeability to this day. And they were actually in a phase 3 clinical trial for a drug called lorazepam, which is an AT101 receptor inhibitor. This is the receptor that triggers the zonulin release. And as of now, as they finished their phase 2 trial, phase 1 and phase 2 trial, and they're going to phase 3, they have over 800 human subjects where they've given this leaky gut drug to, which is seen to, and these are specific to celiac disease patients, and they found that these patients didn't develop intestinal permeability, and there was really little side effects. Now, there's some limitations with this drug, and I'm not sure if this drug is going to be the answer for leaky gut in the future, but it does have some promise for people that have celiac disease and intestinal permeability, because if they can block that leaky gut mechanism in celiac disease, then they can dramatically reduce the risk of inflammation and the potential development for inflammatory and autoimmune conditions in the future. So the reason I want to mention this drug too is I'm pretty much convinced that once this drug finishes phase 3 and they do the second trial and get FDA approval for this drug, then the entire world is going to know about leaky gut as mainstream medicine. Until there's a drug developed, it's pretty doubtful that despite the extensive amount of literature, we're going to have leaky gut being used in healthcare conditions, meaning that if a person has chronic disease and they walk into their gastroenterologist office or to their rheumatologist or to their family physician, they're not going to be diagnosed. Despite the fact that testing is available, the research is there, I think it's going to take a drug that's going to come out that's really going to then make people officially look at it as a disease. Now, or a condition. Now, when we look at the intestinal permeability, let me explain a couple of things that are really important. When you look at the so-called leaky gut, intestinal permeability, one of the key things you have to understand is there's actually two different types of intestinal permeability. One is called transcellular permeability, and then one is called paracellular permeability. So if you look at the gastrointestinal tract, they have these epithelial cells, and so these are cells. And if it goes around them, that's called paracellular. In between my fingers here, there'd be some proteins that are stuck here. Those are called tight junction proteins. They kind of keep this gate open, but keep it open very limited to small molecular weight particles. And then once these tight junction proteins break apart, and this is something that zonulin opens up as a protein messenger, then you can have what's called paracellular permeability. Now, there's another type of intestinal permeability that's called transcellular intestinal permeability, or transcellular leaky gut. And that's where it's not so much the proteins between these tight junctions that are destroyed, but the entire cell has been destroyed. So instead of having cells that are in line here, they're just destroyed. They're just gone. And then food proteins can go through. So there's paracellular and transcellular intestinal permeability in the actual immunological literature. And one is definitely worse than the other. I mean, if you have transcellular permeability, that means you have severe inflammation, destruction in the gastrointestinal tract. And in a clinical setting, that would change the prognosis of the outcomes as far as treatment goes. Now, the other key thing that is important to understand is that when someone has intestinal permeability, the worst scenario that researchers have found is when they develop something called endotoxemia. And what that means is there was dysbiosis in the gut to begin with before the intestinal permeability. And dysbiosis means imbalance in gut bacteria. And when we look at the gut, we have healthy gut bacteria, and then we have unhealthy gut bacteria. And if you get a diet that's really high in sugar and refined foods, processed foods, and very low in vegetables and fibers, you get bacterial changes in your gut where you have these adverse and pro-inflammatory type of bacteria. And then if you have a diet that's really healthy in vegetables and fruits and fibers, and you don't have any infections in your gut, then you have a bacterial population which is considered healthy. And then these bacteria really help balance out many physiological pathways in our physiological systems. So dysbiosis is referred to as a person who's got an abnormal shift. Their diet is bad. They have this adverse bacterial populations in their gut compared to a healthy gut. And when people have dysbiosis, there's bacteria that releases something called LPS, gram-negative bacteria. And these gram-negative bacteria, these lipopolysaccharides, what they're called, they get through the opened up tight junctions of leaky gut, and they get into the bloodstream. And that's called endotoxemia. So the actual toxin gets into circulation. Bacterial end products get into the LPS compounds from these dysbiotic bacteria get into circulation. And when these bacteria get into circulation and cause endotoxemia, these LPS particles bind to what are called toll-like receptors. And these toll-like receptors are found all throughout our body and pretty much most of our tissues. And they turn on this inflammatory reaction. And in the literature right now, there's been so much published on this, and they have found this endotoxemia pathway associated with everything from systemic inflammation to autoimmunity to depression to cardiovascular disease to renal pathology to various cancers to rheumatoid disease to insulin resistance to metabolic syndrome, because it just amplifies the inflammation. So people have these conditions ahead of time, but once they get this endotoxemia, it makes everything much, much worse. It exaggerates their prognosis in a negative way. So this is one of the relationships that's actually published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature: transcellular permeability, paracellular permeability, and this concept called endotoxemia. So not all leaky gut's the same. Not all leaky gut has the same degree of severity. Whether someone has just their tight junctions broken or has paracellular, or whether someone has endotoxemia, they may have a completely different effect. And this is why if people are doing testing for intestinal permeability as a practitioner and they see multiple patients with intestinal permeability, but some have severe reactions than another, one person may actually have this endotoxemia mechanism, one person may just have paracellular, one person may have transcellular, and these things make a difference. Now, I can tell you for myself as a clinician, and when I teach to healthcare professionals in my postgraduate courses at the Crosby Institute, is I tell them, listen, there's 5 key questions you always have to have when you're trying to look at leaky gut. is the leaky gut paracellular or transcellular? Has only the tight junction proteins broken, or has the entire cell been destroyed? That completely changes the severity of the leaky gut. If their entire gastrointestinal endothelium has been destroyed, such as a transcellular leaky gut, I mean, there is significant inflammation there. Infection, gastrointestinal autoimmune diseases, it's a different scenario than if it's just the tight junction proteins. The second question I ask as a clinician and teach other practitioners to look for is there actually endotoxemia? Has this gram-negative bacteria produced this LPS particle that gets into bloodstream and then turns on inflammation throughout the body? And we measure that. We measure that through something called lipopolysaccharide antibodies in blood. So my second question is do they have endotoxemia? My third question is do they have intestinal permeability in combination with blood-brain barrier permeability? Because numerous research papers have found that when you have leaky gut issues, you also have blood-brain permeability issues. And myself and Dr. Vijnani, we've published papers in the World Journal of Gastroenterology and the International Journal of Molecular Science where we showed some of these relationships as well. And then the fifth question is, has a person developed autoimmunity? Because we know one of the major risk factors is when people get intestinal permeability, they develop autoimmune disease. So in a clinical setting, those are the five things that I ask for as a clinically. So number one, is the permeability paracellular, transcellular? Is there endotoxemia? Is the blood-brain barrier permeable? And then, number four is what is causing the intestinal permeability? We got to figure out what's causing the issue, and then has autoimmunity developed? So those are the five things. I think I skipped four before, but those are the top five. So we do laboratory tests to identify these. There are lab tests that I use in my practice and practitioners use that measure what are called the zonulin including antibodies and actomycin antibodies. And then those antibody markers will let us know if it's transcellular or paracellular. And then to measure if this endotoxemia phenomenon has taken place, we measure what's called LPS antibodies. And that lets us know if this leaky gut has not progressed to this chronic inflammatory issue. And then if there's, to check for blood-brain barrier permeability, we do another test, like S100B, aquaporin antibodies, or just blood-brain barrier protein antibodies, also available through Cyrex. We test those to see if that's also permeable because they have a strong association with each other. And then has autoimmune disease developed? We look at tissue antibodies. I do a panel through Cyrex called array number 5, which checks over 20 different tissue antibodies where they would check for thyroid autoimmunity, joint autoimmunity, gut autoimmunity, adrenal autoimmunity, neurological autoimmunity, target proteins, and we get a good screen if any autoimmunity has developed. So that's like the most important workup. Now, the big question is what causes it, and lots of things can cause intestinal permeability, and that's going to get into myths. But for the most part, any inflammation, chronic inflammation in the gut has a chance to cause intestinal permeability. So if anyone has a chronic inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, or celiac disease, they're going to have some degree of intestinal permeability. People that have really bad diets can have intestinal permeability. People that are extremely gluten sensitive, dairy sensitive, can have intestinal permeability. Any kind of an infection in the gastrointestinal tract can cause intestinal permeability. High degrees of stress for extended periods of time have been shown to cause intestinal permeability. Being hormone deficient, whether it's thyroid hormones or progesterone or estrogen, can impact and promote intestinal permeability because hormones are important to regenerate the gut. There's also research that shows traumatic brain injuries can lead to intestinal permeability. So those are other factors that are involved there. And then there's also research that shows that diabetics, if they can't control their diabetes and their glycated hemoglobin gets elevated, their HbA1c gets elevated, that inflammation can break down the tight junctions. There's also new research that's showing one of the biggest associations with developing intestinal permeability is just the body mass. And they can see a linear relationship with as a person's body mass increases, they are more prone to have leaky gut. And part of the reason is because body fat has cells called adipocytes, and adipocytes create these inflammatory proteins which have been shown to break down these tight junctions of the gut. So we know that just having an increased body mass index can increase the risk for permeability. Researchers have found cigarette smokers, they get all this oxidative stress, can end up with intestinal permeability. So those are other key factors as well. Now, those are the key things I wanted to kind of talk to you about. I mean, as a clinician, you got to go and figure all these things out and what's going on. And and then there's been lots of nutraceuticals published to help with intestinal permeability. And people are using things like dietary protocols, like being an autoimmune paleo diet, getting rid of inflammatory food like gluten, dairy is an effective strategy to help. Nutraceuticals like vitamin D, glutamine, short chain fatty acids. People have been using bone broth as a way to help heal the gut. Those are the most common protocols that have some papers behind it that can show that can help healing of the gut. Things like zinc carnosine have been shown to be somewhat beneficial. So those are kind of the simple nutraceuticals. So that's kind of like a summary of the big picture of laboratory testing, what's happened with research, and then some of the nutritional supplements published in the literature to impact intestinal permeability. So that's just the background I wanted to give you, but that doesn't go into myths yet. So when I was thinking about this topic, I go, there's 5 common things that constantly pop up as myths and leaky gut. So I want to share them with you. So number 1, one of the most common myths out there is that there's no research on leaky gut, and that's not true. And you'll hear this again, basically with professional healthcare professionals, typically in a conventional medicine model where they just aren't used to, they haven't heard of leaky gut as a disease or diagnosis, so they just think there's no research on it, it's theoretical. And at this point, in the National Library of Medicine, PubMed.gov, there's 5,003 papers that have intestinal permeability in their title, and there's more papers that are on leaky gut that aren't in the title, but there's at least 5,000 scientific publications on intestinal permeability. And now the term leaky gut is being used more and more, even in research circles. So there's 385 papers on leaky gut. For a long time, people were not using the word leaky gut in scientific papers, so people couldn't find anything. Physicians would hear patients that have leaky gut, they go on to PubMed to look at scientific papers, and they wouldn't see anything. They go, well, this doesn't exist, but the real search term should have been intestinal permeability. But there is absolutely lots of research on intestinal permeability at this point. So that's a myth that there's no research on it. Now let's get into the second myth, which is really where we see on websites and books. And the myth number 2 is you can fix leaky gut with nutritional supplements and taking probiotics, glutamine, other nutritional, another whatever magic supplement of the week is to fix leaky gut. And the answer to that is maybe, maybe not. And if you have to understand, first of all, leaky gut or intestinal permeability is not a nutrient deficiency. It's not caused by a nutrient being low. Okay, so the thought of just giving someone a nutritional supplement to fix it is a logic that does not clinically make sense. So you have to ask the question, what causes intestinal permeability? Well, like we talked about, lots of things that cause intestinal permeability: hormone deficiencies, inflammation, autoimmune diseases. So the supplements that are typically used to support leaky gut are things like glutamine, things like short chain fatty acids like butyrate, things like marshmallow extract. These are botanicals, and all they do is they have an anti-inflammatory effect on the gut, and they can help the gut heal a little bit faster, but it doesn't get rid of the trigger that's causing intestinal permeability. So when you read things out there on the internet or books written by so-called experts, and they go, here's the leaky gut protocol, and they have a list of supplements you take, and you have to avoid these foods for a certain period of time, that is not going to do anything for the underlying mechanism in most cases. You actually have to find the underlying mechanism. Now, the only example that I really can tell you where just taking nutritional supplements like corrects leaky gut, like in a real clinical scenario with pre and post testing, is if you actually have someone who, for example, went on a heavy dose of antibiotics, let's say for dental work, their gut got messed up, they got leaky gut from that, and then they go on nutritional supplements and go on an anti-inflammatory diet, and that seems to make a big difference for them. And then you actually see pre and post testing change. Or you can have someone who was under severe amounts of stress that ended up with leaky gut, maybe from overtraining or, I don't know, finishing finals, and then you support their gut with things like glutamine and different nutraceuticals, antioxidants, and clean their diet up with it, and then the gastrointestinal system heals. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't do those things. It just means to expect, like, I'm going to take a nutraceutical and it's going to be fixed is really not accurate. And if you are presenting with leaky gut, if you've been tested, have leaky gut, the question to ask is, what is causing it? What is the mechanism that's causing it? And let me explain a few things. Some mechanisms you can't fix. Now, like autoimmunity itself can cause intestinal permeability just from the chronic inflammation. If someone has a chronic inflammatory disease, that chronic inflammation is going to constantly break down those tight junctions. If someone has chronic prediabetes and has high amounts of HbA1c, that's going to constantly break down the tight junctions. There's no amount of supplements that may counteract that. They may be supportive, but they're not going to fix it. So I would say the nutritional model for leaky gut, actually fixing pre and post test dramatically, is maybe 20% of what's out there. And the other 80%, you really can't change the leaky gut markers until you can manage the underlying mechanisms that are causing intestinal permeability. So that's one of the major disconnects out there. So the myth of just taking some nutraceuticals and going on a leaky gut diet, which is usually gluten, dairy free, or an autoimmune paleo diet where they go grain free also, is not going to be enough. Is going to be supportive, but unless you find the underlying cause and manage that, it's not going to have much of an impact. Okay, myth number 3. If you have multiple food sensitivities, when you're reacting to all these foods, then you have to have intestinal, you have to have leaky gut. That's the cause, right? No, that's also a myth. When people start to have multiple food sensitivities, what actually has happened to them is they're losing what's called oral tolerance. And oral tolerance means that their immune system is having an overactive response to dietary food proteins. And intestinal permeability is one mechanism of oral tolerance, but there are many others. You can have overactive dendritic cells. You can have regulatory T cells that are dysfunctioning. You could have Kupffer cells in the liver that are overreactive. I talk about all these in a program that I developed called the 3D Immune Tolerance Protocol. If you're interested in it, you can go to Dr. K News and check out that program. I've also written articles on it on Dr. K News. But what really causes multiple food sensitivities is really loss of tolerance. And in working with many chronic patients over many years, I can tell you there are many patients that do not have leaky gut but have chronic and ongoing development of food sensitivities that we can measure with elevated serum antibodies, and it's different than just having leaky gut. So to assume that having multiple food sensitivities is always associated with leaky gut is not correct. There's many other mechanisms that cause that. Myth number 4. If you fix your leaky gut, you will get rid of your food intolerances. And again, maybe not, and most likely not. To some degree, you may reduce your inflammation, but you may not be able to change it. So let me give you some examples. In the scenario where someone has leaky gut from just a really bad inflammatory diet, maybe some antibiotic use, and the tight junctions broke down, and they took some supplements and cleaned up their diet and the tight junctions healed. In those scenarios, you may see changes on lab tests, and you may see some changes in symptoms and reactions to food proteins. However, there's a large group of people that have other mechanisms besides that. So a great example is celiac disease. Like, you're not going to fix someone's leaky gut and have a celiac disease patient consume gluten. That does not happen. In celiac disease, there's a specific genotype. And in celiac disease, when the gluten comes in, that gluten compound binds and activates intestinal T cells, and they cause an overreactive response. And they also cause an actual release of zonulin. And fixing leaky gut is not going to change that. So that's not going to stop that from happening. So if a person has celiac disease, then they're always going to have reactions to gluten, for example, whether you fix the leaky gut or not. Now, supporting their leaky gut and allowing it to heal faster, reducing inflammation in the gut may reduce their symptoms and their overall inflammation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to eat gluten, as an example. Then there's other people that have, for example, cross-reactivity or molecular mimicry, where they're sensitive. Like, there's a large group of people that are sensitive to nightshades. Nightshades being things like tomato and eggplant, foods with seeds in there. And when they get exposed to those foods, they make antibodies against them. And those antibodies have been shown to cross-react with rheumatoid factor and joint proteins. So whenever they eat their food protein, they get significant joint swelling and inflammation. Fixing their leaky gut may not necessarily change that reaction. You may actually heal their gut, but as soon as they get exposed, their circulating B cells in their blood is going to raise antibodies. Those antibodies are going to immediately cause reaction against their joints. Their inflammation may go down to some degree if you can really impact their leaky gut, but you're not going to get rid of that cross-reactive reaction to those food proteins and joint tissue. So in many cases, just fixing their leaky gut and having pre and post testing show that you fixed it is not going to necessarily get rid of food intolerances, because other mechanisms that cause food reactions, that it's not just associated with leaky gut. And some people, fixing their intestinal permeability will definitely reduce their inflammatory reactions and some of their food intolerances, but it's a small group of them in a real world setting. And then number 5, the 5th myth. Autoimmune diseases are caused by intestinal permeability, and if you fix the leaky gut, you will cure the autoimmune disease. That is not true. I can tell you with 100% accuracy that's not true. First of all, autoimmune disease is not, it's on the list of uncurable diseases. The word curing autoimmune disease is a very strong word. What's realistic in autoimmune disease management is to put someone in remission. So meaning that autoimmune disease is not flared up. They're actually not having the degree of autoimmune attack against their own tissue, or their inflammatory responses has come down. So cure is not going to be part of this. Once someone has an autoimmune disease, it's on the list of uncurable conditions. They're going to have to deal with autoimmunity forever. Now, how aggressive their autoimmune disease is and how often it flares up may absolutely be impacted by the health of their gut. So if they have an inflamed gut with lots of tight junction breakdown and food proteins are getting through and triggering their immune response, if they can reduce their food protein exposure that's causing those breakdowns and then heal their gut, then they're going to have a reduction in the total inflammation, and that might help their autoimmune disease potentially go into remission, but it's not a cure. And the other key thing to understand is that autoimmune diseases themselves, the inflammation from autoimmune disease, can also cause breakdown of tight junction proteins. Let me give an example. Let's say someone has Hashimoto's disease or rheumatoid arthritis, and what triggers their autoimmune disease is just lack of sleep and stress for like 2 days in a row. And then autoimmune disease goes crazy. It was unrelated to anything they ate. That inflammatory response from the autoimmune disease can absolutely break down their tight junctions and cause leaky gut, and that is an ongoing up and down pattern with many patients have autoimmune diseases. It doesn't have to always be a food protein. So any autoimmune trigger can now cause them to have their leaky gut get worse, and now they have to support it to get better. So many patients with autoimmune disease are in a real world clinical setting or dealing with leaky gut all the time. They're taking supplements to calm down their gut inflammation, that sometimes they can just take a break from it because they're feeling good. Sometimes they have to really focus on their diet and healing their gut to really function. So it's an up and down ongoing thing with them. So those are the main myths with intestinal permeability. I know I talked for a long time, and I know there's a lot of people have joined to ask questions. So my wife,
hi,
Dr. Reyes, Andrea Reyes.
And our dog is making an appearance.
I know our dog Lily is here.
This is a weird day, sorry.
Okay.
So, you covered this, but I'm going to ask it again because a lot of people are saying.
Sure.
Jonalyn is asking, so is zonulin a protein that causes leaky gut?
Yes. So zonulin is a cellular messenger protein that binds to a receptor called AT1001 and opens up the intestinal tight junctions. And that actually is a normal response. We have to have this zonulin protein there. So if we do get an infection, we can open up our intestinal barrier, become permeable to flush out the pathogen. Now, zonulin levels levels have been shown to just go up with people that have leaky gut. And there's also a protein called zonulin-including antibody, which is the actual tight junction protein binding of zonulin to it, which breaks down in autoimmune diseases, in leaky gut patterns, and that can be measured. So the test that I use in my practice is a panel for the Cyrix laboratories called Cyrix 082, where they measure occludin zonulin, that tight junction being occludin, bound to zonulin proteins, and if there's antibodies to them, if there's antibodies to them in very high levels, that indicates that the person has leaky gut. The Cyrex-2 also measures what I call actomyosin proteins, and that is the protein that keeps the cells stuck to the gut. So when someone has transcellular, so not that the tight junction is broken down, but the actual cell has been destroyed, these actomyosin proteins break down. And with the Cyrex-2, we can look at zonulin occludin antibodies for paracellular and actomyosin antibodies for transcellular to distinguish what kind of leaky gut pattern they have. Some have both.
Oh, sorry.
Next question.
There's questions, yeah. Okay, so this is a common question. Any thoughts on the Zoomer test? Wheat Zoomer, brain Zoomer, as compared to Cyrex?
Yeah, I mean,
Explain that.
I personally don't use a Zoomer test, don't recommend Zoomer tests when patients come in with Zoomer tests.
Why?
I don't consider the testing valid, and the reason why is because they do a methodology called microarray analysis, and microarray analysis is not good. The gold standard way to look at antibodies is something called ELISA. So, some of these labs that do microarray analysis, they do really great marketing to practitioners. And to me, when I see a practitioner ordering those tests, I just go, in my head, I always think when I read the test of who ordered it, I go, you don't understand gold standard testing. And most of them don't even know what the difference is with microarray analysis. So it's not done. It's just done because they don't have knowledge in the fields of testing. But as a person who's done their PhD work with antibodies, and I can tell you, doing ELISA for my doctoral research, which is the gold standard, there's no way in the world I would have had my thesis committee approve me doing any research with microarray analysis, because they would go, that is an inefficient form of testing. Why would you ever do that? So the same applies to clinical practice. So why do practitioners, why do labs do it? Because with microarray analysis, it's cheap. So you can test all these food proteins and then offer a test that's much, much cheaper than gold standard ELISA test, which is the way to test. So I don't like Zoomer testing, and it's not the lab or the company, I don't care. It's just that the technology is not ELISA. So I'm not a fan of any laboratory test that's not ELISA for looking at any kind of antibody, because it's not the gold standard.
Okay. Tina, when one has leaky gut, what are the possibilities that they will have SIBO as well? Can they both be treated together or one before the other?
Well, if someone has leaky gut, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. However, if someone has small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, let's say confirmed by a hydrogen methane test, they're probably going to have leaky gut. And the reason is because leaky gut doesn't cause small bacterial overgrowth. It just causes undigested proteins to go through. But when people have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, what happens is bacteria from the large intestine comes into the small intestine and creates this very inflammatory response. And the inflammatory response that causes leaky gut can occur from that response in SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So I would say having leaky gut doesn't cause SIBO. However, if you have SIBO, there's a really strong chance you may have intestinal permeability, because it's part of the disease, part of the pathophysiology of bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine.
Okay. From Leah, can you measure LPS and how?
So you can measure LPS, and to measure endotoxemia, meaning that it's in the blood, you have to do blood testing. So unfortunately, you can't do it through a stool test. You have to measure serum lipopolysaccharides with a blood test to determine if those endotoxemia compounds are actually in circulation.
Okay. Genevieve, how do you know if it is transcellular versus paracellular permeability? So maybe explain those both again.
Yeah, we repeated this a few times if you get a chance to hear it again, but just really quickly. You can do a laboratory test. The one I use, for example, is one through Cyrex. It's called array number 2. They measure paracellular through occludin zonulin antibodies. They measure transcellular leaky gut through actomyosin antibodies. And they measure endotoxemia by looking at lipopolysaccharide antibodies in blood. So it's a blood test to look for this leaky gut mechanism.
Okay. Victoria, is it okay to take SCFAs every day? And how do they work to heal leaky gut?
Sure. Is it okay to take short chain fatty acids? And those are typically going to be butyrate if you're looking for the supplement. There's really butyrate, acetate, propionate. It's best to take all three, but most commonly available one you're going to find is just butyrate. And butyrate has been shown in, I believe, 4 studies now to actually help synthesize the tight junction proteins, including and clotted proteins back together. And short chain fatty acids like butyrate have also been shown to shut down regulatory T cell responses to inflammation. So they activate the Treg cells to an anti-inflammatory effect, and they help with synthesis of tight junction proteins in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, if you don't have access to short chain fatty acids as a supplement, because sometimes they're hard to find, and we have people from many different countries that are joining our talks, just eating fiber and fiber products actually increases your own intestinal short-chain fatty acids. So one of the best things you can do to help support leaky gut is just consume fibrous foods, and even take a fiber supplement or a fiber powder. And fiber itself will eventually convert to short-chain fatty acids, and that will have a beneficial effect on the tight junctions.
Okay, Leaky, I'm guessing that's how you say. Why would you want to distinguish between paracellular and transcellular leaky gut?
Yeah, so the reason you want to distinguish between the two is because just subtle inflammation in the gut can cause paracellular leaky gut, but you have to have severe intestinal inflammation to cause transcellular. So if I get a leaky gut paneled back and I see someone has transcellular leaky gut, I'm looking for celiac disease. I'm looking for intestinal autoimmune disease. I'm looking for an infection, because those things are severe. Those things cause significant enough of inflammation to actually destroy the gut epithelium to that level. If I just get back paracellular tight junction proteins, that can be caused by lots of subtle general inflammatory mechanisms. It doesn't have to be as severe. So number one, it changes what I'm looking for as a clinician to the cause of their leaky gut. And number two, I know if they have transcellular, that it's going to take, it's a serious condition going on, and the prognosis is much worse as far as healing and helping their gut recover.
Okay. Eloy, can fasting help heal leaky gut?
Yes. Fasting can help heal every tissue in the body. So if you look at the research on fasting physiology, it literally turns on the expression of all genes that are involved with repair and regeneration, whether it's the brain, whether it's joints, whether it's the gut intestines. And this is why for many people and many cultures, they've done fasting as a regimen to just heal gut inflammation and chronic pain and symptoms. So another phenomenal approach to healing leaky gut is to do fasting, whether you do multiple day fasting or alternate day fasting, or you do a fasting window, like a 16-hour fasting window and then 8-hour eating window. Those all have an ability to help with tissue recovery and regeneration, including repair of the gut.
Okay. Sui, can mast cell activation syndrome be linked to transcellular leaking?
So mast cell activation syndrome is a phenomenon where there's a genetic susceptibility to an over-responsive histamine response. And the inflammatory response caused by histamine rush with mast cells can absolutely potentially cause tight junction protein breakdown. So you really have to try to calm down that mast cell response to heal the gut. And if the intestinal permeability is there, especially if they have endotoxemia, where they have dysbiosis and that bacteria gets through the leaky gut patterns and gets into circulation, it can absolutely amplify this response with mast cells. Mast cells activate what are called leukotrienes and prostaglandins, which create significant inflammation. And if LPS is also involved with activating these toll-like receptors, the severity of the mast cell response can be much worse. So just healing the gut may have some potentials to decrease the severity of the inflammatory response from a mast cell syndrome, even though you still have to treat the mast cells individually in the leaky gut.
Okay, Lynn asks, and it's kind of put together, this is so complex. How do we know what issues to start with first?
Right.
What do we do? Because it's a very complex.
Yes, and this is true. Lynn, this is complex, and this is why it's so frustrating to see people talk about your leaky gut cure in 30 days and do all this mumbo jumbo that's all over the internet. and especially when you see it with so-called experts that are writing all these books on autoimmune disease and all these things, and you just go, wow, where is the disconnect? So for me, I think of two things. Have you not read any research papers? Or number two, have you not ever practiced in real patients? Because when you do both, you realize that it's more complex and not that simple. So we are working on finishing a book on leaky gut that explains all these things in much more detail and simplified manner, so we can teach you how to work through the process. Hopefully we can get that out early next year. I think we're done with the first draft, and we're cleaning it up and editing it and working on it. But it is what it is. I mean, I wish it wasn't this simple. It'd be nice to just take glutamine and it's all fixed, but that doesn't work for a majority of people. So hopefully talks like this and more information we can put out. If you check out our website, Dr. K News, drknews.com, I write articles. We have newsletters. If you join us on our Facebook page, we do these talks every week. We can try to give you more and more pieces of the puzzle to help you in your journey if you're trying to figure out what to do with your health.
Okay. My question on occludin. Occludin, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Alexandre says, occludin is part of the main component of proteins holding together tight junctions that connect individual intestinal wall cells to each other. The detection of occludin antibodies suggests the tight junctions are breaking down.
Yes.
This shows the mechanism involved in damaging the intestinal barrier membrane. Zonulin is the protein that directly regulates the permeability of the intestines.
Correct.
Antibodies to zonulin indicate compromised tight junction regulation. This can be occluded presence of an ongoing mechanism involved in damaging the intestinal barrier.
What's the question?
It got lost. Sorry.
Okay.
I think maybe they're just trying to clear something up. I'm not sure.
That was all correct.
Way to go. Crud. I would love a Dr. K cheat sheet, Genevieve, that has the gold standard testing info and sensitivity and specificity of each test, as well as what mechanisms will skew the results.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I know. Like what you mentioned about adrenal testing in your thyroid book.
Right.
Since I can't order blood work and I'm new to looking at it, but I'm finding, this is a great question, that it's imperative for healing mechanisms for those with delayed healing. Genevieve is asking. She's putting together a lot of stuff people are asking. What do you do? How do you do it?
I understand. This is the frustrating thing about gold standard testing. You know, in reality, every practitioner that's out there is vulnerable to marketing from labs.
Very true.
And most physicians and healthcare professionals don't have training in laboratory testing, and just assume that if a lab is offering it, it must be valid. And also, most don't take the effort to really determine that. And then, to be quite honest, most physicians and most healthcare professionals don't know how to read research. They kind of just go to the conclusion and assume that's right, but they don't understand data analysis statistics. Well, all that means is just the fact you're a patient that's sick. If you walk in the healthcare system, you may not be getting the gold standard testing and have the best approaches. But there's a lot of great practitioners and doctors out there that are always going to postgraduate seminars, always learning, always trying to figure out what to do. I have a list of healthcare practitioners that have gone through the training that I provide, where we teach them all this material at the Krosian Institute, krosianinstitute.com. And you can look for the practitioner list. There's some great practitioners there. If you're looking for someone to help you that is really passionate about learning, and it's not easy. So we're going to do our best. We're trying to put together books, we're trying to put out information. But this is part of the effort. So
it's a good effort. You're doing a good job. Okay. I never compliment, so good job. Okay, Sean, was hoping you would discuss SIFO today. Where does it fit into your spectrum of leaky gut, and what test approach is used?
SIFO.
SIFO. I don't know what that is.
Maybe
Sean, what is that?
Maybe SIBO, SIBO.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I don't understand that question, so I'm going to have to skip that.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what that is either. Sorry about that. Okay, so people are asking about fasting. You're recommending fasting for healing, but that's assuming that your blood sugar is stable. People are saying, what if fasting is a stressor?
Yeah, so I'm not saying everyone should do fasting here like gut. There's definitely people who have to work into fasting.
Yeah.
If you take a person who has blood sugar up roller coaster rides and hypoglycemia and they just try to fast, they're going to have a stress response and make their leaky gut worse.
Yeah.
Fasting is something you have to work into. So the first thing is, if you're addicted to sugar, have sugar cravings all day, there's no way you're going to be able to fast because you're really dependent upon physiology that's burning and using sugar for energy. So if your immediate go-to when your blood sugar drops is fruit or something sweet, and you do that every afternoon at 2 to 3 o'clock, and you crash, there's no way you're going to fast without falling apart. So what happens is you really have to, in order to go into fasting without all the side effects and being able to tolerate it, first thing people have to do is be able to cut off sugar from their diet. That might take them a week or 10 days. And then once they can cut down sugar, the next step, then at that point, some may be able to go into a fast. For other people, they still are not going to be able to do a fast. They're going to have to actually train their body to burn fat for energy versus sugars, which is required for fasting. In fasting, you have to get into ketosis. So they can kind of start with getting into ketosis with a ketogenic diet for a while. And then once they get into a ketogenic diet for a while, their body will then be able to do fasting without all the side effects after a few weeks of being in a ketogenic diet. So that was this easiest, smooth transition to it. But you can also heal your gut without fasting if you just reduce the inflammatory foods in your gut. It's just fasting will help your tissues regenerate and repair like nothing ever published. I mean, it's amazing.
Okay, so there's quite a lot of people just saying thank you so much for your straightforward answers. Like,
Oh,
really,
my pleasure. I'm trying. Yeah, thank you.
they're really very happy about it. It's very nice. Thank you.
Well, I would say if you're a healthcare professional listening in, realize like leaky gut's not easy to treat. You know, like there's a lot of things behind it, and the model that you may have been taught at someone's seminar or something you read may not be clinically real. So give yourself a break, and then if you're a practitioner, if you're a patient listening in, realize that it is complex too, and there's lots of factors there, and just know these so you're not so confused and frustrated when you're reading information that's out there.
Right, exactly. Right. Okay. So a lot of people are asking, would you please discuss mast cell and histamine, since it comes up a lot?
Okay, we're going to put that on the list.
Everyone asks about it all the time.
And everyone asks.
Mast cell, and I'm writing it down.
That's the next talk.
Is it?
Yeah, mast cells,
right.
histamine.
All right. Okay, Margot, what about spore-based probiotics?
Spore-based probiotics are just like anything else. They're just another nutraceutical for the gut. Whether it's a short-chain fatty acids or glutamine or probiotic, it's not gonna. Well, let me put it this way: the reason why someone has leaky gut isn't because they're deficient in a spore probiotic. So it's not the cause. It's just something that can help support the gut. But the people who sell spore-based probiotics, I mean, I've seen the advertisements. They promote it as like, this is the way to fix everything, and this is why no one else has fixed everything. That is just, misleading marketing. Spore probiotic is nothing, to be quite honest, nothing special. It's just another probiotic. Some people really benefit from it, and some people don't have any benefits from it, just like any other probiotic strain. Some people will swear that it helps them if everyone takes this probiotic strain because it worked for them, but it may not have any effect on someone else, whether it's spore probiotic or not. And research is showing that probiotic will only have an effect on someone based on that person's host microbiome. And if you need that bacteria species, then you have a response. If you don't, so they're not the same for everyone.
SIFO is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Thank you, Susan. Sorry.
Small intestinal fungal overgrowth.
We're so bad at acronyms. Okay, Sean.
It's just
small intestinal fungal.
It's just another name for having yeast in your gut.
Okay.
And a lot of things in healthcare too. People relabel stuff all the time to sound like it's cool, or they're doing cutting edge stuff. Oh, I don't treat. They used to call it Candida syndrome. Now I guess it's small intestinal fungal overgrowth to sound like you're cooler. They used to call people like with adrenal fatigue, then they call it like adrenal disorder syndrome. I mean, it's just another name for it. If you have fungal overgrowth that are measured, let's say with laboratory tests, like with a gut mycology test, then that indicates that there's something causing your immune system to be weak. So yeast overgrowths happen in the gut only when the gut immune system is compromised. So that could be an infection, that could just be chronic inflammation, but it's not. It's always caused by something else. So you have to really find the cause of it. And as long as a person does have fungal overgrowth, they're going to be extremely sensitive to sugar, and that's going to really cause them to have inflammatory reactions and symptoms and bloating and distension. So they have to go off sugar, and they have to find the cause of why their gastrointestinal system is so weak. So
Okay, we are the only people that don't know what SIFO.
I'm sorry, I don't need to read a lot off on the internet.
Sorry, everybody. So everyone's like, "Come on." I'm sorry.
There's not much papers, or I don't know of any on CFO in the peer-reviewed literature, which is where I spend most of my time.
That's really funny. Okay, sorry. Have you seen clinically or in literature any correlation between elevated ferritin or iron overload and leaky gut?
Yes. So elevated ferritin is
Johnny.
Elevated ferritin is an acute phase reactant, which means there's systemic inflammation. So systemic inflammation can cause tight junction proteins. As far as an actual research paper connecting the two together, I have not seen that. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because there's 5,000 peer-reviewed papers on leaky gut out there. But I would only assume that since it's well established that intestinal permeability takes place from systemic inflammation, and ferritin is a marker for systemic inflammation as an acute phase reactant, that you're going to see some association between them.
Okay, Margot's asking, what/where are the autoimmune diseases that Dr. K and Dr. Vijayani have mapped out for cross-reactivity? Is there a place you have that? Besides your brain?
We've only published our findings so far with Hashimoto's and type 1 diabetes. We haven't published the other ones yet. We have a few papers in publication right now for review, but it's a long process. So we've done a lot of the research. We just haven't been able to publish it. And unfortunately, the way journals work is if you can't say any of your findings and make it public, or you can't publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. So it's like you have to hold on to what you know until you can actually get it published, then you can talk about it. So give us a little time.
Okay. Sorry. Yay, mast cell talk. Sorry, people are really happy about mast cell talk. MCAS connection to dysautonomia as well? Question.
Mast cell activation syndrome, dysautonomia. We'll talk about, again, mast cells and histamine.
I know, I'm
again,
sorry.
next time.
Like it's every question.
Dysautonomia can dysregulate the immune system, can perpetuate any kind of immune disorder, but it's not a direct cause of mast cell activation syndrome.
Sorry, I'm going to read through the mast cell comments. Okay, Cindy, do you recommend berberine for insulin control? A lot of people are asking about
insulin control.
Insulin control, yes.
Okay, that's another. We'll do that as another topic.
Berberine insulin.
Insulin. Okay.
Insulin.
We'll make a list.
Sorry, 1 second. A lot of people are also. I lost my train of thought. Never mind. Sorry.
Okay. Well, as far as berberine goes, berberine absolutely has a beneficial effect on impacting insulin resistance, high blood sugar levels. And there's been so many clinical trials in humans with berberine right now that they have several meta-analyses published in the literature. Meta-analysis means you have multiple clinical trials, and then you take all the data, make it into a composite score, and then see where all the research weighs one way or the other. And it's very clear that berberine, as a natural botanical, impacts insulin resistance. We'll do a specific talk on that as well.
Okay, write it down. And then there's still a lot of questions on fasting. If you want to maybe send people.
We're going to do a talk on fasting.
So we have mast cell, fasting, and
insulin, and
this is really funny. No, they're good topics.
Histamine. Okay.
Then another sorry. We mentioned.
By the way, please, if you do have suggestions, we're going to take those to account. I mean, we really appreciate everyone taking the time to join in. It's I can tell you, as a person who spends his entire life doing this, it's nice when actually someone cares. Someone's interested in what you do. So when you see so many people watch these videos and tune in, it's really enjoyable, because you have all these thoughts that you think are cool, but no one else really does until you find someone who's interested, and then you're really happy. So we're happy to share information, but also again. Help us with joining following us on Facebook or YouTube, join our newsletter, Dr. K News, because the more people that are interested, the more often we can do these things, and the more excitement is on my part to want to share it, because then I know there's people that actually do care and are interested in it. So thank you so much. I think it's one. So
do you want to do you use the OAT test, or do you want to OAT test?
I don't know what that test is. So
I don't either. Sorry.
Anyways, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you found this topic useful for your questions. We get leaky gut, and thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.